Hashtag the CEO accidentally slept on a single dad's shoulder. What he did next left her speechless. The moment Elena Hartwell closed her eyes on Flight 2247 from Chicago to New York, she had no idea that the next 3 hours would change the entire trajectory of her carefully constructed life. She was exhausted in the way that only truly broken people can be, not just tired in her bones, but hollowed out somewhere deeper, in a place sleep couldn't reach. And yet, somewhere between the hum of the engines and the dimming of the cabin lights, her head slowly, almost imperceptibly, fell sideways, and came to rest on the shoulder of a complete stranger. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that the universe puts the right people in our paths at exactly the right moment, like this video, drop a comment, share this story, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. This channel exists for people like you and stories like this one. Elena was 38 years old, the CEO of a mid-sized marketing firm that she had built from a single rented desk in a co-working space into a company worth $11 million. From the outside, her life looked like a masterclass in ambition fulfilled. But no one saw what happened after the board meetings ended, the empty apartment, the dinners eaten alone over a laptop, the way she had quietly convinced herself that success was enough of a companion. She hadn't cried in 2 years. She told herself it was strength. Her therapist, the one she stopped seeing, had called it something else entirely. She had boarded the plane last, breathless and frazzled, dragging her carry-on down the aisle with the particular energy of a woman who had not eaten since 6 in the morning and had just delivered a presentation that could make or break the next fiscal year. She collapsed into seat 24B without so much as glancing at who sat beside her, pulled her blazer tight across her chest like armor, and within minutes, the exhaustion that she had been white-knuckling against for weeks finally won. The man in seat 24A was named Daniel Reyes. He was 34, though the quiet sadness behind his eyes made him look somehow older and younger at the same time. He was traveling back to New York after a job interview in Chicago, an interview for a position he desperately needed, at a company that had seemed genuinely interested until they asked about his availability for overnight travel, and he had gently explained that he was a single father to a 6-year-old daughter named Rosie, and that overnight trips would require careful arrangement. He had watched the interviewer's expression shift in that barely perceptible way that told him everything before the phone call that never came confirmed it. He was sitting on that plane with $52 in his checking account, a folder of rejection emails he kept meaning to delete, and a hand-drawn card in his jacket pocket that Rosie had made for him that morning, covered in crayon hearts and the words, "Daddy, you will win." When Elena's head came to rest on his shoulder, Daniel startled. He looked at her, really looked, and saw a woman who was deeply, profoundly worn down. Her brow was furrowed even in sleep, as though her mind refused to grant her a full reprieve. There was a faint crease of stress along her jaw. Her hands were balled into loose fists in her lap. Daniel had worn that exact expression for the entire year after his wife Maya had passed from a sudden cardiac event, leaving him alone with a 2-year-old and a grief so immense it had its own gravitational pull. He recognized exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. And so, quietly, without waking her, without sighing or shifting or doing what most people on a crowded plane would do, he simply stayed still. He let her sleep. He turned his phone screen to the lowest brightness and sat with his own thoughts, letting this stranger rest on his shoulder for the next 2.5 hours while the city lights of the Midwest faded beneath them. He did not sleep. He did not complain. He sat there and let one tired human being simply rest, because he knew, from the deepest and most honest place in himself, what it felt like to need someone to just hold still for you. When the descent announcement crackled through the cabin and Elena's eyes fluttered open, the disorientation hit her first, then the warmth, then the mortifying realization of where her head had been resting. She jerked upright with an apology already burning on her lips, her face flushing crimson, her professional composure shattered in an instant. She turned to face him with horror and found Daniel looking back at her with an expression she had not expected, not irritation, not amusement, but something that looked remarkably like gentle understanding. He told her, simply and without theater, that it was completely fine. That she had clearly needed the rest. Elena stared at him. In her world, people did not respond to inconvenience with grace. In her world, every interaction had a price tag, a negotiation, an angle. She had built her entire career on the assumption that people ultimately acted in their own interest. And here was this man, this quiet, steady, ordinary-looking man, who had sacrificed his own comfort for 2.5 hours for a stranger, for no reason she could identify except basic human decency. She asked him if she could buy him a coffee once they landed. He hesitated in the way people hesitate when they're calculating whether they can afford to say yes to something, and that hesitation told her more about his situation than any words could have. She didn't push. She simply said she'd like the company if he was willing. They sat in a terminal coffee shop for 40 minutes, and somewhere between her third apology and his second laugh, Elena learned about Rosie and the crayon hearts and the interview that hadn't called back. She learned about Maya, told in careful, loving sentences that made it clear grief had not made him bitter, it had made him more human. And Daniel learned about the empire Elena had built on the bones of her loneliness, and how she couldn't remember the last time she had let herself need anything from anyone. They were two people who had arrived at the same altitude of exhaustion through entirely different journeys. Before they parted, Elena took a business card from her blazer pocket, the same blazer she had gripped like armor on the plane, and she slid it across the table. She told him that her company had been searching for a client relations director for 4 months, and that what she needed most in that role was someone who knew how to make people feel genuinely heard. She said she had a feeling he was very good at that. Daniel looked at the card for a long moment. Then he looked up at her and said the interview would need to work around school pickup. Elena said that would not be a problem. And she meant it in a way she had never meant anything quite so much, because somewhere over the clouds between Chicago and New York, a woman who had forgotten how to let herself be cared for had been given, without asking, the most generous gift, proof that kindness still existed in the world, offered freely, with no expectation of return. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that the quiet, unwitnessed acts of kindness are often the ones that change everything, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Kindness Corner. Every share puts this story in front of someone who might need it today. And before you go, drop a comment below telling us, what is the kindest thing a stranger has ever done for you? We read every single one. Some people walk into our lives for a layover and leave us with a direction. Sometimes the shoulder you accidentally lean on belongs to exactly the person you were meant to meet. And sometimes, the universe doesn't need a grand design, just 2 tired people, an aisle seat, and the quiet grace of someone who chose to stay still.